Hi everyone! The sound of cicadas rose and fell like waves against the indigo sky as I stood at the kitchen sink washing the last of dinner off the plates and saw my faint reflection in the window above the farmhouse, which stretched silent behind me except for the occasional creak of its ancient bones. Adrian was working late again in his study, his muffled voice echoing through the walls as he dictated notes into his recorder. This had become our new normal, a quiet rhythm of chores and solitude bound only by routine, and I wasn't. My life was as orderly as the row of crops outside the window, predictable as the sun's rise and fall, but somewhere beneath the surface a restlessness simmered, a quiet longing for something I couldn't name that summer evening as the golden light faded. Adrian was a good man, stable, reliable, and hardworking, but his work always seemed to demand the best of him, leaving only the scraps for me over the years since I had grown accustomed to his absence. When Adrian entered the kitchen in twilight, his tie was loose, and he had the appearance of a man who was still working with one foot in the kitchen. "I ran into someone today," he said, casually pouring himself a glass of water. "Marcus." I froze, my hand hovering over the sink. "Your brother, half-brother?" Adrian corrected his tone, which was neutral. Adrian hardly ever mentioned Marcus, the result of their father's first marriage. The divorce had been ugly, and their mother's resentment had crept into Adrian's perception of Marcus over the years. Adrian put the plate down and turned to face him. "What's he like now?" Adrian shrugged, as if the response didn't really matter. "Maybe rougher around the edges, he's hit a rough patch, divorce, business troubles, that sort of thing," Adrian said. "I told him he could stay here for a bit just until he gets back on his feet." Adrian wasn't the type to offer help easily, especially to Marcus, who he described as reckless and unreliable in the few stories he'd shared over the years. Brushing past me to get his briefcase, I thought we had the room that night, so I lay in bed and tried to picture Marcus. I had only seen him in old photos, and he was scruffy, lanky, and always smiling mischievously, which stood out from Adrian's reserved manner. One particular detail that stood out in family portraits was that Marcus had their mother's fair skin and their father's dark skin, a deep mahogany that made him stand out next to Adrian's lighter complexion. Adrian rarely mentioned it, but I could tell it was an additional layer to their mothers. Marcus showed up 2 days later, pulling into the driveway in a beat-up sedan that seemed to bend under its own weight. I watched from the porch as he stepped out with a duffel bag slung over one shoulder. He was taller than I had anticipated, with a lean frame and easy movements. His dark skin gleamed in the afternoon light, and his hair was cut close and flecked with gray. The thought of having someone else in the house breaking its silence was both unnerving and strangely exciting. His voice was warm and rich, and he said, "You must be Isabel." I said it was Adrian's idea, but not rudely. As I let him in, I noticed his eyes looking around the house, taking in the worn furniture and creaking floors with a kind of appreciation. "This place is character," he said, "and it feels lived in." I led him to the guest room, where he unpacked with the ease of someone who had done it too many times before. By the time Adrian returned home that evening, Marcus had already. As he sat down, his laughter filled the living room as he told a story about their early years. I stood in the doorway and watched Adrian lean back in his chair with a rare smile tugging at his lips. It was odd to see him that carefree, almost boyish. Over the next few days, Marcus's presence was a disruption, but not an unwanted one. He brought a humor to the house that I hadn't realized was lacking, and he was always willing to help, whether it was repairing the squeaky porch swing or carrying groceries from. When he joined me for coffee on the porch in the mornings, we watched the world wake up in friendly silence. He asked me questions about the farmhouse, the land where I lived before Adrian, but they weren't intrusive. Rather, they were thoughtful, as if he genuinely wanted to know me. Adrian, on the other hand, was busier than ever, his hours at the firm growing longer as the summer went on, and he hardly seemed to notice how Marcus's presence changed the mood of the house. But I also noticed how he lingered when he handed me a dish in the kitchen, his fingers briefly touching mine, making me wonder if it was an accident. How his eyes met mine across the room, holding my gaze for a moment too long, and how my heart quickened during those moments, revealing a hunger I hadn't dared to name. However, I told myself it was nothing, a harmless moment of attention in an otherwise boring life. The summer sun poured into the bedroom, its warmth broken by the faint rustle of the breeze through the open window, and I found myself looking forward to Marcus's presence, even though I told myself I shouldn't. I was kneeling on the floor, surrounded by an increasing mess of dust bunnies and forgotten trinkets, and my arm was reaching blindly under the bed, where an old silver bracelet Adrian had given me was hidden in the shadowy abyss. My fingers grazed something cool and smooth years ago. I strained further, pressing my cheek against the wooden floor. Almost there, I told myself, but as I shifted my weight, my elbow knocked against the bed frame, pushing me into an awkward position. I cursed under my breath, twisting in an attempt to free myself, but instead I made it worse. For a brief moment, I lay there half stuck under the bed, a ridiculous sight Adrian would have found absurd and might have snapped a photo before assisting, but Adrian wasn't here and wouldn't be for hours. The sound of the front door opening and closing made me freeze, but Marcus had left earlier in his usual self-assured stride, heading toward the barn to tinker with some tools. The idea of him discovering me in this state sent a shockwave through me, and I was still unsure whether to call out or keep quiet when I heard his voice. Isabel. His voice had a playful lilt. You hiding, or did you forget I live? I muttered a little assistance as I felt his hands on the bed frame lifting it slightly to give me room to wriggle free. I pushed myself out sitting back on my heels and brushed dust from my shirt. Thank you, I said, avoiding his gaze. Here, up here, I managed to say the words, muffled by the mattress above me in the bedroom. His footsteps approached, and I squeezed my eyes shut as his shadow filled the doorway. What are you doing under there? Marcus asked. Amusement was evident in his tone as he asked, tilted his signature grin, and tugged at the corner of his mouth. You have something, he said, reaching out and brushing his thumb across my cheek. I froze as he pulled it back, smudged with dust. Bed monster got you good, he teased, sitting on the floor next to me. I laughed nervously, running a hand through my hair. This wasn't my best moment, he said, as the air changed and the laughter subsided into something quieter and heavier. You've been good to me, Isabel, Marcus said, watching me, his smile softening into something unreadable. His words were more subdued than you had to be, and I wasn't sure how to react. I could feel the warmth of his presence as he moved closer, and even though I didn't say anything, his words carried a different weight from him. His eyes briefly touched my lips before returning to me. Does it feel that way to you? I should have stood up, laughed it off, and said something about Adrian or the bracelet, but I didn't. Instead, I sat there, unable to turn away from the moment that was stretched, fragile, and taut. Then, before I could think, Marcus leaned forward and kissed me, a quick, gentle kiss that was filled with a kind of longing that left me gasping for air. It lasted only a heartbeat before he withdrew his expression, which was a mixture of vulnerability and regret that I shouldn't have done that. His voice was rough, and I stared at him, too stunned to speak, my heart thumping so loudly that I was certain he could hear it. As he left the room, his footsteps retreating down the hall, I sat on the floor, my lips tingling where his had been, my thoughts spinning wildly. I should have felt angry or disgusted, but instead I lingered a vivid memory of the way he had looked at me, the way he had made me feel seen, desired, alive. He stood suddenly, running a hand over his face and saying, I'm sorry, Isabel. That won't happen again. I nodded, still unable to form words. Marcus sat at the small kitchen table nursing the last of his wine. After dinner, he lingered, his usual jokes and easygoing banter noticeably absent, instead of the usual clink of dishes as I dried the last plate and put it in the cupboard. The smell of dinner, which included roast chicken, rosemary, and garlic, filled the room with a sense of warmth that felt too heavy for the moment outside. Outside, the crickets chirped in rhythmic harmony, their song punctuated by the occasional croak of a bullfrog in a pond. I asked, breaking the silence, "What's that?" His tone was low, and his gaze held mine for a beat too long before he looked down at his glass, turning it absently in his hand. I replied, as usual, but the words felt hollow because nothing about my days had felt normal. He was watching me, his dark eyes following me around the kitchen. It was the kind of attention that made the air feel too warm despite the open window. Marcus's kiss, and the way his lips lingered on mine for just long enough to leave me reeling, were moments I had replayed countless times since that afternoon in the bedroom. I told myself it was a mistake, a lapse in judgment on both of our parts, but the memory clung to me, haunting the quiet moments when I was alone. I felt like a wire stretched too tight, waiting for something to snap. As I wiped down the counter, I became acutely aware of his presence, the way his chair creaked softly as he leaned back, and the faint rustle of his shirt as he shifted. "I guess I've had a lot on my mind," I said, keeping my back to Marcus, and I froze for a moment, my hand stilling on the counter. The weight of his words hung between us, heavy and undeniable, and slowly, I turned to face him. He was watching me again, his gaze steady and unflinching, as if daring me to say something. The silence between us was no longer just silence, but a space filled with unspoken words that were charged and fragile. I wanted to say something, anything, but my mouth wouldn't open. Instead, we stood there, the distance between us feeling insurmountable but too small, and my heart was beating so loudly that I was certain he could hear it. His voice was barely above a whisper, and he stood closing the distance between us in a few deliberate steps. I should have stopped him, stepped back, and said his name sharply to remind him and myself that this was wrong, but I didn't. I remained motionless as his presence grew closer. When he got to me, he hesitated, his hand hovering inches from my arm as though he was asking for permission. Then, with a quiet assurance, he cued my face in his hands, his touch steady and warm, his eyes searching mine for something I couldn't define. And then he kissed me. This kiss wasn't like the first one. The world outside the kitchen, the crickets, the dishes, Adrian, and everything that remained was the fire of his touch and the way he held me. When he finally pulled away, I swayed slightly, instinctively reaching for the counter to steady myself. Marcus didn't move, his hands still cradling my face, his eyes locked on mine, and his expression was serious, almost pained, as if he knew. It was as if something inside me that had lain dormant for years roared to life in his arms. I couldn't resist, couldn't stop something that had been dormant for years from roaring to life in his arms. He began, but the words caught in his throat. He let his hands drop to his sides and stepped back as if to give me time to process. I touched my lips, still tingling from his kiss, and my mind was racing with contradictory ideas. I whispered, my voice breaking, and he nodded, his eyes dropping to the floor. I know the room felt too small, the walls closing in on me as excitement and guilt wore on me. I had crossed a line that I couldn't uncross, and the truth hit me like a cold wave. But underneath the embarrassment was something much more dangerous, a sense of aliveness and being seen in a way I hadn't experienced in years. "Good night," Isabel, Marcus said in a quiet but firm voice, and then he turned and left the kitchen, leaving me standing there alone with the weight of what had just happened. For what seemed like an eternity, the refrigerator's faint hum was the only sound in the room until I turned off the light, which plunged the kitchen into darkness. But even in the dark, the memory of his kiss lingered. The days that followed felt like walking through a fog, with every step heavy with a me of guilt and longing. I went about my daily routine, folding laundry, watering the garden, organizing the pantry, but every task felt hollow, as if my life had suddenly been robbed of meaning. Adrian came and went, his briefcase always in hand, his phone buzzing constantly with calls that kept him tethered to his work. He didn't notice the shift in me, or perhaps he didn't want to. It was the still moments. I could still feel the warmth of Marcus's hands on my skin and hear the soft tone of his voice when he'd said my name. It wasn't just the physicality of it that haunted me. It was the way he looked at me as though I were something extraordinary. When was the last time I'd felt that way? Adrian and I had built a good life together, comfortable, stable, and safe. That was hardest during the quiet hours between chores when the house was silent and my thoughts spiraled. Brought flowers home when he recalled an Aries who worked tirelessly to make sure the mortgage was paid and the bills were never a concern. He was dependable, loyal, and kind, but somewhere along the line our relationship had turned transactional, our love buried beneath years of routine and quiet compromise. I couldn't completely blame Adrian because I had done my part, settling into my role as the dependable wife and putting all of my energy into keeping our house in order while ignoring the parts of myself that had once been vibrant. And the way Marcus made me feel bright and visible, like a light had been turned on after years of dimness, was what drew me to him. I tried to tell myself it was just a fleeting infatuation, a spark that would fade with time, but every look he gave me and every moment we spent in the same room only made the pain worse. Somehow, I had stopped being Isabel and became Adrienne's wife, a shadow of the woman I once was. I was pruning the roses in the front yard one afternoon when Marcus came out of the barn wiping his hands on a rag. I pretended not to notice him, but I could feel him watching me, his gaze heavy with something unsaid. "You've been quiet," he said, his voice breaking the stillness. I looked up for a moment, shielding my eyes from the sun, and he nodded his expression. "I've had a lot on my mind." Unreadable. You ever consider what you want, Isabel? Not what Adrian wants or what the house needs, but what you want. The question hit me harder than I anticipated, and I returned my attention to the roses, my hands shaking a little as I clipped a bloom. I don't know, I've been thinking about that for a long time. I was able to feel the weight of Marcus's silence for a moment, and when he finally said, "You should think about it," I watched him return to the barn, his shoulders tense. I loved Adrian, or at least I thought I did, but love alone didn't feel like enough anymore. Did love mean sacrificing the parts of myself that yearned for something more? Did it mean staying in a life that felt safe but stifling? What about the night I lay awake in bed staring at the ceiling as Adrian's quiet breathing filled the room? The air felt heavier after he left, as if the conversation had opened a door I wasn't ready to walk through. Marcus, was it really him that drew me in? Or was he just a mirror reflecting the parts of myself that I had buried? The dreamer, the adventurer, the woman who once thought she could be anything? Was he the answer? Or just the catalyst for the questions I'd been too scared to ask? I turned over on my side and looked at Adrienne's sleeping form in the moonlight. He appeared calm, his features softened by sleep guilt, and my chest was twisted, sharp, and unrelenting. He had done nothing to deserve this, nothing to justify the betrayal that was simmering inside of me. But in the days that followed, I started to notice the cracks in the life Adrian and I had built. These weren't new. They had been there for years, hidden beneath layers of habit and compromise. But now that Marcus was in my life, they felt impossible to ignore. Every glance Marcus gave me and every unspoken word we exchanged chipped away at my resolve. The tension between us wasn't fading, but rather growing into an unstoppable force that drew me closer to a precipice. I wasn't sure I could back down. The thought of leaving scared me, but our life together wasn't perfect, but it was solid, a foundation I could rely on even if it didn't fulfill me. Walking away from it felt unthinkable, but staying felt unbearable. As the days turned into weeks, I found myself slipping deeper and deeper into my thoughts, questioning everything. My marriage, my desires, my sense of self, every dinner eaten in silence, every conversation that felt like a checklist, every moment of emotional distance. There was a constant reminder of the choices I was too scared to make, but I didn't know what or when. The sky was a canvas of gold and amber, dotted with soft pinks that melted into the deepening blue of the horizon. I sat on the terrace with a glass of wine in my hands, staring at the setting sun. The air was warm and still heavy with the earthy scent of summer. It was a moment of perfect calm, but my mind was racing like a storm. The farmhouse behind me was quiet. Adrian was in his study, as he frequently was, and the faint hum of his voice on a call could hardly be heard through the open window. Inside, everything had always been structured, stable, and predictable, but outside, beneath the vast expanse of sky, I felt the pull of something completely different. I didn't hear Marcus approach at first, and then he was there, lowering himself onto the bench next to me. His presence was like gravity, impossible to ignore, and at first, there was silence between us. But wasn't empty, it was heavy with everything we hadn't said. Beautiful evening, he finally murmured, his voice low. I nodded, unable to find my own words. My heart had started its now familiar rhythm, faster and louder. Whenever he was near, I couldn't look at him, afraid of what he might see in my eyes. He leaned back, his arm brushing lightly against mine. The contact sent a shiver through me, though the night was warm. You've been quiet lately, he said, his tone soft but probing. So have you, he chuckled, a sound that was both amused and... I turned to him, and as the sun set, his features were cast in shadow and light, and his dark skin seemed to glow in the golden hour. His expression was intense but unreadable, and I felt the weight of his gaze as my resolve began to crumble. Marcus, I started, but he didn't let me finish the thought. Instead, he reached for my hand, touched me gently but firmly, and said my name, Isabel, before I could think or remind myself of all the reasons this was wrong. He leaned in and slowly found my lips, and this time I kissed him back without hesitation. I felt completely alive, with every nerve ending igniting to life when we finally broke apart. I was out of breath, and this time he didn't pull away. Instead, he stayed close, his forehead resting lightly against mine, his hands still cradling my face, and his eyes meeting mine with something raw and unguarded. I stared at him, not understanding what he was saying, but he said, "Don't have to keep doing this." His voice was steady, but full of emotion. "This life, this place doesn't have to be the end for you," he said. "You and I could go somewhere far away where no one knows us, start over, build a life that's ours." His words hung in the air, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. I looked for any indication that he wasn't serious, but his expression was resolute, and he reached for my hands, holding them. "I know it's not easy," he said, his voice soft but urgent, "but consider this. You're not happy here, Isabel. You haven't been for a long time, and I can see it, I can feel it, and you deserve more than this half-life." I couldn't tell why, but the tears in my eyes were painful, and all I could do was sit there with the weight of his words pressing down on me. He wasn't just offering an escape, though. He was offering me the opportunity to rediscover myself, to emerge from the shadows of a life I had long stopped recognizing as my own. Marcus. He abruptly interrupted me as I was trembling, saying, "I don't know if I can. You don't have to decide now." He held my gaze for a moment longer before releasing my hands and standing, and I watched him walk back toward the house, his silhouette framed by the fading light. He didn't turn around, leaving me alone with the weight of his words and the limitless stretch of possibilities they had unlocked. The transformation was gradual. The life Adrian N. I had built was no longer a sanctuary. Rather, it was a prison that I had helped build with my own hands. Every morning I woke up thinking the same thing. This isn't my life. The farmhouse, which had once been a symbol of stability, seemed to be suffocating every glance Adrian gave me. At first, it was just an idea, a fleeting fantasy born from Marcus's words on the terrace. The more I thought about it, the more it took root. Adrian had always been careful with money, keeping a tight hold on our finances, but I had access to joint accounts with passwords scrawled on sticky notes in his study pattern of trust built over years of habit. At first, I told myself it was just a precaution, a small fund in his account. It felt like an anchor, his steady presence a reminder of the weight I carried. I knew he would never understand what I felt, the way I had been unraveling for years. So slowly and carefully, I began to untangle myself. Marcus had a way of making the impossible seem possible. He knew people from his troubled past who specialized in creating new identities, so even though it was risky, he assured me it could be done. For weeks, we worked covertly, gathering photos, filling out forms, and practicing the ACT. In the event that everything fell apart, I transferred small amounts of money, never enough to raise suspicion, into a private account I had opened in my name alone. Everything about our new lives, including my name, my daughter's name, Marcus's name, and everything else, would be erased and replaced with new identities that were untraceable. Emily was the hardest part. I didn't want to uproot her and take her away from the life she knew, but it was unthinkable to leave her behind at 5 years old. She was too young to comprehend the decisions being made around her, and too innocent to question the carefully crafted story I would feed her while I put her to bed one night. Marcus was my anchor through it all. He spoke with a clarity and focus that I envied, and he painted vivid pictures of the life we would build together, a small house by the sea, Emily playing in. Her little fingers clutched the edge of her blanket. Just you and Uncle Marcus. Her eyes lit up, and she nodded eagerly. I kissed her forehead, swallowing the lump in my throat, telling myself it was for her too, for a better life, a freer life. The three of us were living fearlessly and without restrictions in the sand, and his faith in the plan was contagious. I found myself clinging to it like a lifeline, but escape wasn't enough because I knew Adrian wouldn't let me go so easily without a fight. He was a man who valued control and thrived on order, and if I left, he would pursue us and drag us back into the life. I was so desperate to get away that I couldn't let that happen, so I started to dismantle him piece by piece. It started with a remark I overheard at a business party subtly implied that Adrian wasn't as trustworthy as he seemed, so I sowed doubt among his coworkers, creating a web of half-truths and insinuations. I was aware of his weaknesses and vulnerabilities, and I took advantage of them. A misplaced document here, a missed deadline there, made it simple to make him appear irresponsible and distracted, and the rumors spread until they reached his superiors. I could see the strain in his shoulders as he stayed late at work in an attempt to restore his reputation. He never suspected me because I was his wife, his partner, and the person he had trusted for years. When the dismissal came, I pretended to be shocked and held him while he vented his frustration, giving hollow reassurances while secretly planning our timeline. Without his income and position, he would not have the means to fight for custody or find us. It was cruel, and it tore at me, but I told myself that it was a necessary sacrifice for survival. The morning of our escape dawned soft and gray, with the sky heavy with. Adrian was lying next to me, his face slack with sleep, his breathing steady and untroubled. I watched him for a moment, my heart heavy with guilt and resolve, knowing that this would be the last time I'd see him like this, the last time I'd share a bed with the man I had once promised forever. I woke up before the alarm, and the room was bathed in the pale glow of early light. I walked through the house quietly, gathering the last of the things we would need, and Emily's bag was already packed with her. My own suitcase was small and sparse, but it contained essentials and the forged documents Marcus and I had worked so hard to obtain. Everything else, the memories and keepsakes of the life we had built here, would remain behind. "Where are we going?" Mommy Emily asked her, bright-eyed and excited, as I helped her zip her jacket. "It's a surprise," I said, forcing a smile. "We're going to meet Daddy at a special place he visited before us. He doesn't know we're coming. We'll have to keep it a secret for the time being." Emily clapped her hands, thrilled at the thought that she had complete faith in me, and the weight of it weighed heavily on my chest. I stroked her hair, forcing myself to remain composed so that my voice wouldn't tremble. If she sensed my uneasiness, she didn't show it to her. As we packed the car, I took one final look at the farmhouse, and it made me feel both relieved and sad that I couldn't fully comprehend this place was a remnant of a chapter that was about to end forever. I locked the doors behind me and put the key in my pocket on the kitchen table. I left a single envelope addressed to Adrian, with a brief note inside that was written in the quiet hours of the night when I was unable to sleep. "Adrian, I can't do this anymore. I've tried, but I've lost myself in this life, and I need to find her again. Please don't look for me. I hope you understand that I hadn't signed it. There was no need. Would recognize me even if he didn't understand why the drive to the station was quiet, with only Emily's chatter breaking the rhythmic hum of the tires on the road. She talked about the surprise, speculating wildly about where we might be going and what we might find there. I nodded and smiled, my responses automatic as my mind raced ahead. Marcus was waiting when we arrived, standing near the platform with a single bag slung over his shoulder. He looked up as we approached, and his face broke into a smile that was equal parts relief and, "You're ready for the big adventure, kiddo?" he asked in a warm voice, and Emily nodded enthusiastically. "It's a surprise for Daddy." Marcus gave me a quick look, his expression unreadable, but he didn't comment instead. He took my bag, his hand brushing mine in a gesture that sent a shiver through me. Emily ran to him, throwing her arms around his legs in an exuberant hug. He lifted her effortlessly, spinning her in a circle before setting her down. As the train started to move, I turned to the window and watched the familiar landscape blur and fade into the distance. The fields, the trees, the farmhouse. All of it slipped away, replaced by the steady rhythm of the wheels on the tracks and the strange, exhilarating sound of the wheels. I boarded quickly, finding a compartment near the back. The seats were comfortable but worn, and the windows were smudged with streaks of dirt from countless journeys. Emily climbed onto the bench next to me, her dolls safely clutched in her arms. Marcus reached for my hand next to me, his grip firm and steady. I let him take it, and the warmth of his touch grounded me in a way I hadn't anticipated. Across from us, Emily talked cheerfully about the trees, her voice light and carefree, and she didn't notice the tension in my shoulder. ERS, the way my free hand gripped the edge of the seat like a lifeline. I had done it. Adrian had stolen his resources, taken his child, and the enormity of it pressed down on me with a mixture of intense fear and elation. For the first time in years, I felt free of the expectations and limitations that had kept me in place. The future was uncertain and terrifying, but it was mine to shape. I thought about the note on the table and the hollow words I had left behind to explain my absence. I thought about Adrian waking up to an empty house and piecing together the pieces of a life I had shattered. But beneath the guilt there was something else, a spark of freedom and a glimmer of hope. He said softly, as if reading my mind, "I promise you that everything will be okay." I nodded, though my voice got stuck in my throat. I know that as the train took us further away from the life I had known, I leaned back against the seat and closed my eyes. Emily's voice faded into the background, and for the first time, I gave myself permission to think that perhaps, just possibly, I could find the freedom I had been seeking.